Hi everyone, let's kick off. It's just after 12 o'clock. Thank you for joining us today for this month's Lunch and Learn seminar, which is focused on strengthening relationships and connections for young people in therapeutic residential care. My name is Matt Fusarelli. I'm the Acting Executive Director of the Family and Community Services Insights Analysis and Research Directorate of DCJ, also known as FACSIAR. I'd like to warmly welcome everybody. We've had over 900 people register, which is fabulous and shows the interest in this topic across the sector. So in today's webinar, we're going to be hearing from Professor Lynne McPherson, Dr. Kylie Day, and Dr. Antonia Canosa from the Centre for Children and Young People at Southern Cross University. So you'll see them online. So they're going to be presenting their findings from the research project titled Strengthening Relationships and Connections for Young People in Therapeutic Residential Care. So this research was conducted in collaboration with young people aged between 12 and 18, and it reveals the really important role of recognitional practices, that is, being listened to, respected, and genuinely cared about when fostering safety and well-being for this cohort. So they're also going to explore the voices of young people who share their stories through interviews and a survey, and offering insight into what works, what doesn't, and what needs to change in therapeutic residential care settings. This research was funded through the Australian Research Council and the Australian Childhood Foundation and was conducted in partnership with colleagues at the Australian Catholic University, Charles Sturt University, and Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. So following the presentation, we're going to hear from Catherine Dobbins, and Catherine is DCJ's Director for Residential Care, and she's going to provide us with an overview of the policy and practice implications of the research. If you have any questions for our presenters, please put them in the chat during the webinar, and I'll come to those at the end. So there will be a Q&A, there'll be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of this. I also want to let everyone know that this session is recorded, and it's going to be posted on the FACSIAR webpage. So anybody who's registered for the webinar will receive the link. To that. So without further ado, I'll introduce our presenters for this afternoon. So first up, we have Professor Lynne McPherson, and Lynne is the chair of the Out-of-Home Care Research and acting director of the Centre for Children and Young People at Southern Cross University. So Lynne's research program is focused on out-of-home care, including foster care, kinship care, and residential care, where she uses participatory methods which recognise children's rights and promotes their voices and agency in her research. So Lynne is interested in looking beyond care and taking into account the impact of diversity and therapeutic models of care. She's currently involved in an ARC linkage grant titled Strengthening Relationships and Connections for Children and Young People in Therapeutic Residential Care. So welcome, Lynne. We also have Dr. Kylie Day, and Kylie is a senior lecturer at Ganebe College at Southern Cross University and is an affiliate of the Centre for Children and Young People. Kylie is committed to culturally grounded and impactful research. Her research focuses on Indigenous knowledge, teaching practices, and the rights of Aboriginal children in child services. Kylie's led the qualitative interviews with Aboriginal young people living in residential care for this research that's going to be presented today. We also have Dr. Antonia Canosa, and Antonia is an anthropologist and research fellow at the Centre for Children and Young People, and is currently the project manager for the ARC-funded project Strengthening Relationships and Connections for Children and Young People in Therapeutic Residential Care. With a background in childhood studies and a deep commitment to children's rights and wellbeing, Antonia has extensive experience in ethical and participatory research. And finally, we have Catherine Dobbins, who is the Director of Residential Out-of-Home Care in DCJ's System Reform Division. So the Residential Out-of-Home Care branch is the policy, program and strategic commissioning lead for residential care services in New South Wales. Throughout her career, Catherine has led policy development and reform across out-of-home care and social housing policy areas. So look, thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Lynne. Over to you.
Thank you, Matt, for the introduction. And you've heard that I'm Lynne McPherson. I'm in the role of National Chair for out-of-home care research, and you've heard that also, but I'd just like to mention that that's a position that's co-funded and acknowledge that it's co-funded by the Australian Childhood Foundation and Southern Cross University. So before I begin, I too would like to acknowledge country simply by saying that I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're all meeting on. I'm up in Bundjalung country, northern New South Wales. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And we're absolutely delighted to have an opportunity to share our research. We've been working on this project now for almost 4 years. You've heard already the number of partners that we have, so time won't permit me to go back through them, nor do I need to, but I would like to give a shout out to our research team, because we're very much operating as a team, and they include Anne Graham from Southern Cross University, Antonia and Kylie, you've just been introduced to, Kathomi Gatwiri, formerly of Southern Cross University, now of Flinders University. From the CETC and Australian Childhood Foundation, we're partnering with Janice Mitchell and formerly our dear colleague who passed away just a little while ago, Dr. Joe Tucci. We're also partnered by Tim Moore from ACU, Donna Anderson from Charles Sturt University, and we're delighted to be partnering with our international expert, Emeritus Professor Robbie Gilligan from Trinity College. We also have a partnership agreement with FACSIAR, and so on that note too, thank you DCJ and FACSIAR for inviting us to share our findings in particular. But before we get to our findings, it's, I think, important for us to go back to why we thought this research was a good idea and why we went to the Australian Research Council and asked them to fund it initially. So you can see the way that we've described the aim. We know about the importance of relationships. Everybody's talking about relationships, right? But what we don't know, according to the literature and the prevailing research, is the detail of what we didn't know, is the detail about what practices enable or constrain the development of positive, trusting relationships within a therapeutic residential care setting. We didn't want to leave it just at those micro practices that happen inside the 4 walls, or however many walls there are inside a residential care unit, because we also wanted to explore anew the importance of social connections, what's happening out in the community. So we can say with confidence, for the first time, this research asked young people, workers, therapeutic specialists and managers currently living or working in therapeutic residential care about the practices that we use to support young people to develop trusting relationships. What helps and what gets in the way? Well, why does this matter? Relational practices are said to be a core element of therapeutic care. Relational practices lie at the heart of this form of care, focusing on repairing disruptions caused by past trauma, including attachment disruptions. In relation to social capital, we've been really guided by our colleague, our international colleague, Robbie Gilligan, who reminds us time and again of the importance of looking beyond care and outside care. So really looking at whether and how we can continue to develop positive relationships within the community that help to develop young people's identity, help to build resilience and help to build social capital, just as we do with our own children. And we're interested in doing this because of the likelihood of improved outcomes if these aspects of practice in therapeutic residential care can be strengthened. I won't go into too much detail, but to say to you that this is a 4-phased project and we're currently really in the middle of phase 4. So we began with a policy and document analysis that really looked at, well, who's doing what in other places to some extent. Most of the emphasis was on really what are the current policies in relation to therapeutic care across this country. So we didn't just look at New South Wales. And we asked the question about how do they line up with what is known about best practice and what the research tells us in relation to existing models and what works. That formed a really lovely foundation for us to move into qualitative inquiry. And what we mean by that, it's researcher speak, sorry. What we mean by that is listening to and hearing from people. And the first people that we heard from were young people currently living in residential care, but more about that in a moment. So the research question that we addressed in the qualitative phase was, what are the practices? We didn't look at practices just on a micro level. We looked at interpersonal practices and institutional or organisational practices. So some people call those conditions. What are the practices that enable or constrain the experience of positive, trusting relationships within care? To answer that question, we heard from young people and we heard from staff. Again, that formed then a really beautiful foundation for us to develop a bespoke survey where 140 young people and 140 staff, youth workers and other staff addressed this question: can we find associations that are significant? What is the association, for example, between interpersonal and institutional practices and ultimately young people experiencing recognition, positive social connection, and safety and wellbeing? So do these practices make a difference to the way young people feel in relation to their safety? A really important question, and we've now addressed that in terms of where we're up to, and you're going to hear the findings today. And the final phase is where we're at. We're all about dissemination. We're talking and talking, we're writing, we're publishing. We have numbers of manuscripts under review and published, and we'll give you links and information about how you can find and read those after this presentation. We've presented both nationally and internationally already, and we have plans to continue to do that. And I think the last thing to say about the research design, and this was really a 30 seconds or less, I could talk about just the design for a long time, but I won't because we want to hear the findings. It was absolutely participatory. So we've been guided by a group of young people, a wonderful group of young people, all of whom have recent lived experience of residential care. And we meet regularly with that group who at each phase and stage of the research are really not shy about telling us what we're doing well and what we need to get better at. So that's been incredibly helpful for this project. Like any research, we want to be theoretically sound. We don't want to just go and ask questions because we think they're a good idea. So we went to the theoretical literature and developed, constructed a frame that informed the design of the research that we think is really quite innovative and has really enabled us to have both a depth and breadth in this research. The theory of practice architectures, for example, helps us to have a focus on what are people saying and doing and how are they relating. So we're really talking about micro practices and organisational practices and conditions when we refer to practices. The answers to those questions then lead us to be able to conceptualise what could we do differently if we change the institutional conditions, if we change the systems, and if we change the micro practices. Secondly, social capital helps us to look outside the four walls that I mentioned before. Social capital really signals the importance of group participation, but it really is about how are young people linking to the local sporting club? How are young people linking to the possibility of a traineeship? So doing some volunteer work and starting to make some connections in the community. How are young people relating to members of the family who may be able to offer, if not accommodation, post-residential care, then ongoing permanence in ongoing relationships post-care? Recognition theory is all about the act of acknowledging others, the ethically adequate or inadequate treatment of persons, and helps us to look at the question that was a critical question. How is ITC or TRC will use those terms interchangeably. Helping young people to feel cared for, respected and valued. And if we can get that right in residential care, we're halfway there, aren't we? Just that issue of helping young people to feel cared for, respected and valued. Moving on to our phase 1 findings, this is going to be as much information as we have time to present today. So on the basis of our policy analysis, it was surprisingly positive, and I say surprisingly quite seriously, because I think that most of the 900 people present today would be aware that the community doesn't hear a lot of good news about therapeutic residential care or residential care per se. The policies, however, lined up really quite well in relation to contemporary theory regarding trauma, trauma-informed work, the importance of connection to family, the importance of recognition of culture. So as a team, we really thought through and struggled with the fact that, in fact, this was quite a promising finding. That I'm not suggesting that there isn't room for improvement, that would be naive at best. But what we did find was that it lined up really quite well, and a lot of foundational work had been done in New South Wales to ensure that they were really quite spot on in terms of contemporary theory and policy embedded in their current frameworks, or the relatively new frameworks then. So the question really became, what about implementation? What about when the rubber hits the road? Is something happening then, or is it aligned with, are the practices aligned with the policies that guide them? Just a little bit of demographics before we do get to findings. 38 young people between the ages of 12 and 18 spoke face-to-face with us. We almost always visited young people in their homes, in the residential care units. So we learned a lot by observation, as well as sitting with and listening to and hearing from young people. 140 young people then later completed a survey, and on the basis of the survey, 60% were male, 40% were female, and you can see much of the other demographic information there, although we will highlight that almost half of the young people that we interviewed were of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent. Just over half, and these are reports from young people. We didn't then examine files or interview staff to verify. These are reports from young people telling us about themselves. Over half said that they had mental health concerns. About half said that they had ADHD, and 33% said that they had autism. And you can see that 60% said that they were in school, and I flagged that piece of data because one of the findings that we made was that school was quite problematic for a number of young people currently in care. Most of the homes that we visited had 2 young people living there, but I'll make a comment about that one, and that was that there were a number of homes with just 1 person. And in terms of mobility, a number of young people had lived in other residential care homes before, usually for between 2 and 6 months. Let's get to findings. A key finding in response to this question, practices that help people feel cared about, respected and valued. Really putting the pieces of the jigsaw together at the heart of what we heard and learned from young people is that they experienced recognitional practices. What we've called, it's a made-up term, and I think quite beautifully represents what we heard, recognitional practices, and things like staff wanting to spend time with me. They like spending time with me. Wanting to listen to me or listening to me. Staff being honest. Showing that they have my best interests at heart. Now, each of these sentences have up to an hour around them in narrative. So an example might be staff helping me to influence decisions about the things that affect me. So a story about helping a young person to be actively participating in decisions about connection back to family and what that might look like and who they define as family was really important. When it might be that they hadn't necessarily put their hand up and said they wanted to do that, staff enabling and encouraging young people to do that. Some of the time, in some of the homes, we heard that happening. Staff helping me to feel better when I'm down, and we did hear quite a lot about encouragement and support, particularly when they were having times of feeling unable to, whatever it was. Staff noticing when I'm not okay, and you can see just glimmers of the text around that. So you might say this isn't rocket science, but it is rocket science, isn't it, in the context of residential care, that we heard, not all of the time from all of the young people, we heard examples, and they were like gems, of young people who had experienced feeling recognised by staff. And probably one of the biggest things, and then I'll hand over in just a moment to Antonia, one of the biggest things about that was sometimes it was in contrast. So staff like spending time with me. I know that they like spending time with me because they're hanging out playing computer games. They make suggestions that we go down to the dog park and hang out and play, muck around, instead of, and sometimes this word was used, hiding in their office. So instead of hiding in their office inside a residential care unit where young people didn't have access to them, they genuinely enjoyed or reflected on being able to spend really not just recreational but validating time with youth worker staff. Thanks, Antonia.
Thank you, Lynn. So in the survey phase, we built the scale items directly from what young people told us during the interviews. So their words actually shaped the survey questions. And this is what we call sequential mixed methods design. So the young people actually responded using a 5-point scale from strongly disagree, which was 1, to strongly agree, 5. And most average scores sat between 3 and 4. And that tells us that recognitional practices are present, but not always consistently. So sometimes young people felt cared about, but not always. As you can see here, some of the highest rated items were quite powerful. The young people told us they have a worker or staff member who helps me to influence decisions that affect me, who likes spending time with me, who backs off and lets me calm down, and who listens to me. So these were the highest scoring scale items. And these responses really highlight the critical role of recognition in making young people feel safe and well. In the next scale item, we actually used social capital theory, as Lynn mentioned, to create some of these scale items. And we also focused on the interviews that the young people we held in the previous phase. So as Lynn mentioned, social capital refers to resources that the young people access through relationships and networks, and these are facilitated by the workers in Resi Care. The most highly rated practices were staff helped me stay in touch with my family, and staff helped me connect with my culture. And these reflect what we call bonding capital. So those close, trusted relationships that nurture identity and safety. Other items in these scales refer to the bridging capital. So those connections in the wider networks like schools, sports clubs, and cultural organisations. And these really helped young people access new opportunities and build broader social worlds and networks. So the message we heard both from the survey phase and the qualitative phase was that when staff actively support connections, young people feel more anchored, more hopeful, and more able to thrive. So just as Lynne mentioned, recognition is a protective factor, so is social capital. In the next slide, this is where the data gets really exciting and powerful. We ran some mediation analysis, and we found that recognition actually significantly mediates the relationship between relational practices and young people's well-being. So in other words, when staff engage in those practices like listening, showing care, and supporting autonomy, young people feel more recognized, and as a result, they also their well-being improves. And this is why, as Lynne mentioned, we have termed the relational practices not just relational, but recognitional practices. So it's not just about what staff do, it's also about how those actions make young people feel cared about, respected, and valued. And in the next slide, we also found a similar pattern with social capital practices. So when staff helped young people stay connected with their family, with their peers, with their culture, and those community networks, those young people reported higher levels of recognition. And again, higher levels of recognition predicted better well-being outcomes. So this really reinforces the idea that therapeutic care must be recognitional, but also socially connected. And that's what makes the environment healing. So these were really exciting findings for us when the mediation analysis work in this way. And we also looked at safety in the next slide. So we wanted to know a bit more about safety, not just from a physical perspective, but also emotional safety and safety to be themselves. So generally, young people felt safe in TRC, but there were some exceptions. For example, girls, queer young people, and those who moved frequently across placements reported feeling less safe. So safety was really expressed by the young people we talked to during the interviews, not just as physical safety, but also as emotional safety. And you can read Mia's quote here on the left-hand side. Mia is a 15-year-old young woman, a survivor of child sexual abuse, and she was lamenting the fact that there were always male workers placed on in her home, and she didn't feel comfortable leaving her room. So not just physical safety, but emotional safety. But I'll pass on to Kylie now to talk a little bit more about cultural safety, which findings were really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Antonia. Thanks, Lynne. So in here, we look at the critical gaps in cultural safety within therapeutic residential care, and it reveals how the well-intentioned systems that Lynne was talking about can inadvertently perpetrate harm in therapeutic residential care. So these findings reveal the gaps in cultural safety aren't just policy failures, they're daily experiences, generally of misrecognition that compound trauma for these young people who've already experienced significant adversity. So therapeutic residential care was designed as trauma-informed model specifically for children in out-of-home care, and intended to support children who have been experiencing significant adversity, and represents a specialised approach within the broader out-of-home care system. The cultural safety gap that despite trauma-informed design, TRC demonstrates a notable lack of cultural responsiveness. So there's significant absence of Indigenous knowledge systems in its integration. And this gap is particularly concerning given the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care. So there's a little bit of a policy versus practice disconnect. So the Aboriginal child placement principle exists in legislation. However, its culturally safe implementation is largely undocumented, and we see decolonisation sort of rhetoric present in the policy document. but actual practices often continue to reinforce the colonial frameworks. So this information revealed a fundamental contradiction, that we have trauma-informed care, but it fails to be culturally informed. So the very children we're trying to help are experiencing additional trauma through having that cultural disconnection. So looking at the next slide, the cultural disconnection and identity confusion that comes with that, these are the real world consequences of these gaps in cultural safety. So the key point is that there's an absence of cultural support, cultural programming, mentoring opportunities, any sort of relationality with elders. No participant reported having an Aboriginal caseworker or carer. That's quite significant. And this represents a systematic failure for those children and a cultural connection, which all impacts on their identity. So these gaps lead to profound confusion and loss of cultural identity. The young people experience uncertainty about their cultural heritage, and the consequences extended beyond individual confusion to intergenerational disconnection. So there were families of people that had been living in out-of-home care, foster care, and the ones that we interviewed in therapeutic care. So you can see that one person said that I honestly can't even answer that question because I don't know what it means to be Aboriginal. But I'd just like to highlight that these are more than just statistics. These are young people expressing profound disconnection from their identity. So when a 15-year-old says something like that, we're seeing a direct impact of cultural safety failures in the system. So the next slide, we sort of just look a little bit deeper at misrecognition that I mentioned earlier. So to understand how these gaps manifest in daily life, misrecognition is the antithesis of recognition. So it's characterized by lack of love, which related to not being cared for, lack of rights, and lack of solidarity, not being valued. There are emotional consequences resulting in feelings of hurt, shame, and feelings of degradation. And there's 3 practical examples that explain sort of what that means. More so is that there's a casualization of the workforce, which correlated to the lack of love that we saw. So young people feel ignored, disrespected, and treated as inferior in that process. Staff perceived as casual or untrained creates an environment where the youth don't feel generally cared for. So we saw a lot of placement instability. So some children had 60 different placements when we spoke to them. Many had frequent changes throughout the year, and there were so that sort of was relational to the children feeling a lack of rights in sort of where they get put. There were home and safety requirements, which related to sort of lack of solidarity, where young people feel emotionally separated from workers, like the workers were in a separate section and rarely interacted. And there were experienced feelings of feeling inferior and unsafe due to that, which from an Aboriginal point of view related to a lack of belonging and community connection as well. So these were all not isolated incidences. There were systematic patterns that we saw across the interviews. So each example represented a different way that the system sort of failed to recognise all of those worths and recognitions. So going to the next slide, what did the young people want to change in therapeutic care? Rather than just identifying the problems, we listened to them and saw that they wanted to have social connection. They wanted friends to be allowed to visit them in their houses, and their family as well. Their family quite often wasn't always meaning their biological family. It could have been relating to their foster parents that a lot of them had been removed from at 12 years of age and put into therapeutic residential care. They wanted stability of the home environment, the house to feel more like a home for people to sit at the table and have dinner. Future planning and support, they were always talking about that transition year of 18 plus and getting driver's licenses and jobs and possibly going to TAFE. Some had aspirations of uni, so that seemed to sort of keep their resilience going, having that future planning and support. Emotional and cultural support were recorded there as well, where they get help where problems occur, and help with things that they have happened to them in the past, and support to help to connect with culture was brought up, but it wasn't a significant part because there was a complete absence of that, if that makes any sense. Also, the young people talked about staff relationship improvements, so staff to show them more interest and warmth, and staff change jobs less often, and also the need to have better recognition of gender matches for particularly that was from a female young person, didn't feel comfortable having a male supervisor there while she was eating and trying to relax in her home. So young people weren't really asking for luxuries. They were just asking for connection, stability, support, and genuine care in their therapeutic placements. And that goes to the next slide. So what did young people want to change in therapeutic care? There's some mentionings there from Luca and Asha and Felix. So Luca mentioned, I'd like to let the kids have friends over. Make that clear, I want friends over. I'm lonely. I feel like that makes friends think I don't want to have them over. So when in reality I do, it's just that they have these stupid rules here saying I'm not allowed to. So there's not a genuine understanding of some of the ways the system works that further isolates them from having connections. So Luca's experience there demonstrated how rules create further social isolation and shows the impacts of external relationships and friendships that are wanted, and reveals that it's emotionally impacting these young people. So in general, their voices cut through all the professional jargon. They're very straight up in their answers, and they're telling us exactly what's wrong and exactly what they want. And I guess the next question that we should consider are we actually listening? And yeah, just wanted to thank you for being here today to listen to us and our findings, and I'll pass back to Lynne.
Kylie, I think that what we've heard from you right now is just now is very powerful and quite confronting, and I just want to let people know that almost every young person who identified with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage was interviewed by Kylie as an Aboriginal scholar, and I accompanied her with in those interviews. I think that we found, when we put together the literature that we'd analysed, the voices of young people, the voices of staff, and within the framework of the tripartite theoretical framework, the findings for us are indicating 4 key areas for reform and improvement. That really the challenge in revisiting the purpose of the therapeutic milieu, which was at the heart of the intensive therapeutic care reform. Even with that, we seem to have a focus still on structure, safety, without the focus that's needed on prioritising healing relationships, prioritising personal growth, positive peer dynamics, and enabling young people to build trust and resilience within a supportive community. So our first finding, rather, our first recommendation about what needs to change really encompasses that incredible challenge. Many young people, we've just heard from Kylie, particularly those from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, report a lack of cultural safety. So authentic and meaningful connection to culture, I think, is front and centre in terms of what needs to change. And I think, thankfully, in our conversations with DCJ, is acknowledged as needing to change. And the task is really just beginning about what will happen and how it will happen. Social connections that build social capital are absolutely vital because it's a temporary arrangement, not a lifelong arrangement inside therapeutic care. What happens when the young person sets foot outside? Are they connected? Are they having a sense of validation? Are they identifying with people in the community as much as inside the home? And workforce and system implications we've not spoken about today because we haven't presented the findings from the focus groups with staff. Time hasn't allowed for that. But there are significant workforce and system implications. And I'm going to have to leave it at that because I am very close to handing over into Catherine in just a moment. So finally, where we're at. We've talked about where we're at now, where we're heading to next. Our goal is to develop a multifaceted framework, a practice framework on the basis of, and just at a really high level, we're not talking about a detailed framework for implementation. We'd be very happy to talk to anyone about funding for that. So what we're going to develop is a high-level principled framework that addresses the challenges and the issues that we've begun to identify when we reported on these findings. And we hope and expect that there'll be a great deal of interest in that. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Catherine now.
Thanks so much, Lynne, Antonia and Kylie. It's been a great opportunity to hear from you about this research. We've been engaged and eagerly following this research from the outset, and it's really timely and you know, just a gift as we embark on our current reforms to residential care and the out-of-home care system more broadly. And so I just wanted to, I guess, take this opportunity to kind of talk about how we are taking the learnings and the research and evidence from a number of sources, but definitely this research into our reforms that we're currently embarking on. So just to quickly set the scene around what we are considering as our drivers for reform. These are the current system challenges over the last 2 years. There's been a plethora of independent regulator and system reviews into out-of-home care that have given us many recommendations and findings for us to work from and to work towards as we kind of incorporate those into our reform. We've done a like an analysis of all of the findings and can group them into 4 themes, and they are, centering around safety, care experience and practice, workforce capability and capacity, service modules and infrastructure, and system and governance. And you can see the synergies already with some of the findings that that Lynne, Antonia, and Kylie have presented. So there is simultaneous and kind of staged reforms happening across out-of-home care currently. I'm going to focus on what's happening in the residential care space. The New South Wales government has embarked on significant reform across all of out-of-home care. There is a reform plan with 8 key reform directions which have been published on the DCJ website, and that is guiding out-of-home care reform more broadly, as well as specifically the residential out-of-home care reform. So we are currently developing a residential out-of-home care strategy, and that is happening in tandem and alongside a broader out-of-home care strategy. And that will articulate the future vision, strategic priorities and goals for residential care in New South Wales. And following that, there'll be, a detailed implementation plan with actions and measures. We are waiting for, but the New South Wales Ombudsman is currently undertaking an inquiry into ITC, and we are expecting the findings of that to become available either at the end of this year or the beginning of next year. So we'll be definitely incorporating the findings and recommendations from that report through these reforms as we go. And so under that and aligned to the residential out-of-home care strategy, which is currently in development, we're kind of working on continuous improvement, changes to ITC in particular. We have a working group with ITC providers where we work on how we can overcome some system challenges, what changes and tweaks need to kind of be developed up to overcome some of those challenges. And that's been a really constructive process, and we'll continue that. We're also in the process of implementing the first tranche of out-of-home care reforms. And through those reforms, we're introducing 3 new residential care models. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in the next slide. And then, as I've already mentioned, the ITC inquiry will kind of be another pillar for us to build into out-of-home care reform, and we'll also be commencing an evaluation of ITC towards the end of this year. So ITC has never been evaluated, and that will, complement the evidence that will already be available through the ITC inquiry and, this strengthening relationships and connections research. And that will really help us understand, what the evidence tells us about process, the economic side of it, as well as, the original model design. And so all of that will kind of feed into future residential out-of-home care model design and system. So these are the 3 new models that we are in varying stages of implementation or pre-implementation for some of them. And so this, as I mentioned, is kind of the first tranche of out-of-home care reforms that we are implementing. These are specifically the ones that fit into the residential care system. And the purpose behind the first tranche of out-of-home care reforms was to address the most critical issues impacting out-of-home care. And that was children and young people needing to be placed into what we call high-cost emergency arrangements while we continue searching for the next, more preferred placement for them, as well as financial sustainability of the out-of-home care system more broadly. And so what we're in the process of implementing is the Waratah Care Cottages, which are delivered by DCJ. So this represents an expansion of DCJ's residential care service delivery, which has been limited to what we call the Sherwood program for the last 20 years, really. DCJ has not delivered directly residential out-of-home care outside of the Sherwood program. So we are entering or expanding that program through the Waratah Care Cottages, and we've currently got 5 cottages. And we are in the pre-implementation phase of 2 new models, which will be delivered under the permanency support program by our non-government providers. And these 2 models are designed to provide an immediate placement model for children and young people. And so it's up to 13 weeks and will be kind of integrated into the PSP service system, which will enable children to move through into their next placement, whether that's family-based care through relative kin or foster care, or into another longer-term residential care placement. They will be predominantly individualised and delivered by residential care accredited agencies. And our therapeutic care homes will be a grouped therapeutic residential care model, and we are targeting children and young people who are sibling groups or in relatively stable existing residential care groupings, where finding a family-based placement for them is not imminent in the next sort of 6 months, and they would benefit from the stability of having therapeutic residential care and receiving that kind of additional support. And so we've been feeding in to the design of these 3 new models, learnings from this research that Lynne, Antonia and Kylie have spoken about, as well as some other evidence and academic research and the voices of children and young people that we've engaged with in the design process. And so these are some of the requirements that we've built into the design of the new models that we've just looked at. And as you can see, we're really leaning into that relationship as being the key enabler to a more positive placement experience for children and young people in residential care, as well as ensuring that we are incorporating the voice of children and young people into decision-making within the home, and a focus on connection with family and culture. So I mentioned the residential out-of-home care strategy that we're currently developing, and that is drawing on inputs from a range of sources, those system independent and regulator reviews into out-of-home care that I've mentioned. We've also done a comparison of residential care practices in other Australian jurisdictions and really tried to have a look at what's happening in other jurisdictions around Aboriginal-led approaches. We've had a look at international practices and innovations in residential care and academic research on effective therapeutic residential care, and certainly this strengthening relationships and connections research is something that we have really delved into to draw on around what is showing as effective. We've had consultations with young people with lived experience of residential care through our UC Change group, and some knowledge sharing among government and sector stakeholders. And so the strategy is still very much a work in progress, but you can kind of see that we are piecing together from all of those inputs that I've just spoken about. We are centering relational care at the centre, and then key focus areas or priority areas will be the safety and stability, incorporating children's voice and their participation, a focus on children not only thriving in care but being set up to thrive beyond care, and independence and connection to family, culture and community. So I will leave it there because I can see that we've only got 5 minutes left, and I'll hand back.
Look, thank you, Catherine, and to all of the presenters. We do have a few minutes, so let's just dive in. I can see there's a question from Maggie, and for the research team, how can we achieve supporting young people with limits for placements available and high turnover of staff?
Matthew, I'm not wanting to dodge the question, but I'm not sure that it's entirely a research question.
Well, look, it is a difficult one, Lynn. I just noticed a lot of the questions coming through do note, and some of the real practical challenges around
I do have some ideas and some thoughts based on our research about it, but I think that it's a both-and question. It's a question about resource, that the resource is the resource, and you've just talked about some new resources, Catherine, that are coming online. I think that through the benefit of hearing directly from children and young people is that in the moment, on the shift, workers making choices to get alongside a young person versus doing something else are choices that bode very well for their safety and well-being. So I think I hoped presented that today. In terms of where I'm just looking for the write-up of the question. So yeah, I hope that addresses that, but I can say more if you want to.
No, thanks, Lynn. And Catherine, without putting you on the spot, there's a question from Patty. Will the reforms include funding to train frontline workers and their managers?
Look, it's very early in the reform process to, we're at the strategy stage. And what I would say is what we can see is that workforce is the absolute critical element to the success of the reforms. And, we can, if everything centres around relationships and the residential care workers are the key relational contacts for children and young people in residential care, this is our fundamental biggest challenge. And having enough skilled, trained, competent, job-ready residential care workers is going to be probably our biggest challenge, but one that we absolutely have to tackle.
No, thanks, Catherine. I accept it's difficult. Kylie, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that question that was asked about turnover. I've worked a lot with elders, and one of the elders I'm just thinking about says that how to get kids to school, actually, Aboriginal kids. I think it relates here. If they feel safe, if they feel valued, they will stay. And that isn't just for young people, but that's for staff in these systems as well. So cultural safety for staff, having that recognition, it's all related, not just to the young people, but the whole system there.
Thanks, Kylie. Now, you got 30 seconds each. Can I just put one question to the research team, which is, what's the one takeaway message you want people to walk away with?
I'd like to respond to that then. I think that we've heard the best and the worst today. And I think that there is the best is encouraging. That there is the worst gives us some guidance for urgent matters to address. I believe that therapeutic residential care, or ITC, needs to become aspirational. No more talk about placement of last resort. I believe the care needs to offer exemplary micro-recognitional practices by a skilled, competent, caring, culturally safe workforce. I believe there needs to be growth and development in family connection, however family is defined. It could be auntie, it could be uncle, it could be neighbour, it could be other person in the community. And I believe that there needs to be strong strong community connections encouraged and enabled for children. So the key message for me is aspiration and hope. Thank you.
That's a lovely message, Lynn. Did any of your colleagues have something to add to that? Okay, Kylie, I think you're on mute. I can see you speaking.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I would love the audience to take away the transformation needed from, say, misrecognition to recognition is fundamental.
Thank you. Antonia, did you have anything final to?
Just to strengthen the message that Lynn and Kylie just said, that, you know, when young people feel cared about, respected and valued, and when they're connected with their family, culture and community, that's when the healing actually happens. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. And look, so thank you to everybody for joining, and especially big thank you to our speakers. So everybody who's registered will receive the link to the webinar when it's updated. I'd just like everybody to know that the next Lunch and Learn will be on the 21st of October. And it's going to be about early parenthood and out-of-home care, insights to strengthen policy and practice. So the registration details will come through in the chat, and we hope to see you there. So thank you, everyone, and good afternoon.